Welcome to the other side of Lucy Letby. In episode 60, we're going to take a little bypass from the Court of Appeal hearing, and we're going to look at how the Lucy Letby story is developing in the media. By the media, of course, I mean the mainstream media, because social media and the people's media hasn't gone quiet on the Letby affair since it ended. But by now, those of us who are really interested in this case and in the cause of justice, particularly for the families and for the protection of children in general, are well aware that Professor Xu Li has got together a truly unprecedented panel of experts to give their opinion. And I hope to cover that tomorrow. But in the meantime, we'll just clear up all of the other main articles that have been out and are floating around the internet at the moment. The first story up we have is Sarah Napton. Sarah is the science editor for the Daily Telegraph in the UK, and she's a great gal because she's a skeptic, and all skeptics do is ask questions, and rarely, if ever, do they believe the answer. Well, not that the answer is complete or absolute, at least. And Sarah tells us about a major whistleblowing charity who I have to admit I've never heard of, but they're called Compassion in Care, and they're based in the UK. And Sarah tells us that the major whistleblowing charity refused to engage with doctors who blamed Lucy Letby. Again, you don't really need to read any more of this article. A major charity refused to believe supposed whistleblowers working in the NHS when they came to them telling them about one of their own, a nurse, Lucy Letby, harming babies. And the charity said that the accusers did not exhibit any of the usual behaviours associated with blowing the whistle on malpractice or criminal activity. Doctors at the Countess of Chester Hospital, you'll remember this, that they said they began to suspect Letby in 2015, absolute bullshit. And after a string of baby deaths and near misses, and they pleaded with the management to take her off the neonatal ward, but police were not finally called in until 2017. And a lady called Eileen Chubb, C-H-U-B-B, who founded Compassion in Care in 2003, so these people have been around a long time, and was one of the Bupa 7. Bupa is a private healthcare provider in the UK, and there must have been some scandal around them in 2003. The first group to use whistleblowing law in the UK. There was a number of red flags. And where have we heard that before? Red flags for sepsis that were ignored. Red flags for deterioration that were ignored on the Countess of Chester Hospital neonatal unit. But these red flags were not ignored by this whistleblowing charity. And Eileen is quoted as saying, "We had never come across a whistleblower who, if backed into a corner by an employer or the NHS National Health Service, hadn't dialed 999 when people's lives had been at risk." That's what we found staggering. It stood out like a sore thumb, especially in a case where there were such serious concerns. I've never seen a whistleblower who thought babies were being harmed, who left it for more than a week. But in this case, said Eileen, they left it for a number of years. Yes, they did, until after they lost the Lucy Letby grievance hearing against them. That's when they took action. And Mrs. Chubb, who blew the whistle on colleagues who were abusing frail residents at a Bupa-run home in Bromley, Kent, in 1997, said her charity had since dealt with 14,000 whistleblowers and said certain patterns were always present. She carries on, straight away on day one, as soon as the verdict came through, we all said, these are not whistleblowers. Truly stunning from a woman who has dealt with 14,000 whistleblowers. The whole thing looked really suspicious to us. They didn't meet any of the criteria, a lot of the detail which wasn't there. Because we deal with health and social care, you see patterns that are always there. It's often said that there is no God but irony. And here we have Eileen giving us the real equivalent of the discoloration of the skin in these babies. The pattern that wasn't there, which should always be there. Most whistleblowers, Eileen goes on, would say to you, I can remember the moment when this first happened, and it's ingrained into your memory like a hot iron, the detail and what you saw. But that was not there in this case. All of it is completely wrong. It's also very unusual for whistleblowers to keep their jobs. Most are sacked, and if they're not, they're forced out constructively. She added, it's made us reassess everything. If there wasn't whistleblowing, then the whole thing falls for us. And Sarah continues in her article, at the Thirlwell inquiry, which is looking into how deaths could have been prevented, Ravi Jairam, a consultant, was criticised for not telling a coroner about his suspicions of Letby despite having had the opportunity. And we talked about that in episode 1 of this podcast. It was unheard of and unthinkable that any serious physician would not act upon suspicion of harm, particularly to children. At Letby's trial, Dr. Jairam was said to have caught Letby virtually red-handed dislodging a breathing tube from a baby at the Countess of Chester in February 2016. That's baby K. Yet he did not mention the incident until 2017, and during a grievance procedure in 2016, he said there was no objective evidence to suggest Letby had been harming babies. Peter Skelton, King's Counsel, representing the parents of children at the Thirlwell inquiry, also questioned why Dr. Jairam had not raised his suspicion of Letby at an inquest into BBA in October 2016. Dr. Jairam told the Thirlwell inquiry that he should have had more courage to speak up. But, sorry, Dr. Jairam, as we've said before, it has nothing to do with courage. As doctors, we deal with unpleasant things every day, and we do them professionally, hopefully. Eileen isn't buying your crock of shit, and neither am I. You'll have to dig a little bit deeper to persuade me why you didn't alert the coroner to your concerns. So well done, Sarah. Nice article. And then we have another article from Sarah and I think Alex Barton and Will Bolton, who are crime correspondents for the Daily Telegraph. And this article reads, a very unusual incident involving a baby occurred at the Countess of Chester Hospital in the fortnight before Lucy Letby's attacks began. It has emerged. The Thirlwell inquiry heard evidence from a paediatric registrar who was working at the hospital when there was an unusual spike in deaths in 2015. Straight away, I have to say, I wish people would stop saying there was an unusual spike in deaths. The spike in deaths would have been unusual if compared to the usual workload of this unit. In fact, it would have been unthinkable. But as Professor Norman Fenton and Law, Health and Technology on Twitter have shown us, similar spikes were occurring in other parts of the NHS. And remember what I said before, the mortality rate for preterm babies is between 50 and 150 times higher than for term babies. That is a massive multiplier in medicine. Until someone compares the 2014-2013 stats on the acuity, that's how sudden and how sick these babies were in 2015-2016, will tell you whether it was an unusual spike or not. With a multiplier of between 50 and 150, you can see that it wouldn't take much to cause a spike in mortality overall. Now, this registrar, this junior doctor, said at the Thirlwell inquiry that by the time the first unexpected death of baby A occurred in early June 2015, she was anxious because of a strange event that happened 10 to 14 days earlier. Now, in one of my podcasts, I talked about spectral medicine and spectral symptoms borrowed from the Arthur Miller play, The Crucible. And here we go again. Thirlwell inquiry, spectral medicine. And spectral symptoms or signs are things that exist only in the realm of the imagination. They are not real. And they're not real because they don't fit acceptable classifications of observations and findings in babies or in any patient. And here we're about to get a prime example of that. The registrar said that she had provided a statement to the police about this incident. It was very, very unusual. Unusual is sufficient in medicine. We don't have to say very, very, but we do when we're storytelling. And this very, very unusual something, and that is literally the word she uses, something that she hadn't seen before. But we don't use the word something in medicine. We describe what we see in medicine using medical language. Building up to the story now, I was already quite anxious going into BBA and BBB because I'd had a particular unusual event. Well, get on with it. Both, that's BBA and BBB, had unsuspected rashes on June 8, 2015, and this registrar said she was worried that there may be a connection. But what's that got to do with being anxious about something that you've seen 2 weeks previously? That was very, very unusual and that you'd never seen before or since. In a statement to the inquiry, the registrar said, I was concerned that they, the babies, were geographically close to each other and wondered if there could be a link, such as infection, that both children carried, an environmental link, or some form of product contamination. But again, there's no link between these babies and the baby that was there 2 weeks earlier, unless we include the Pseudomonas bacterium, which they all should have known about. Giving evidence about BBB, she said she was covered in a very unusual rash. A rash sometimes we see with meningococcal septicemia. It was a very blotchy rash, but that diagnosis didn't fit in this situation. And there are so many problems with this statement. First, petechiae, which are small bleeds under the skin, which we've talked about before, is the not so unusual rash that we see with meningococcal septicemia. But again, we're about to get a little bit of bait and switch here, because she's telling us that the baby had this rash associated with meningitis, but she didn't have it because the diagnosis didn't fit this situation. And then she goes on to say, the rash didn't look the same. The rash was moving. She also responded remarkably quickly, which is not the case for children with sepsis. What would a typical doctor say about this situation? I noticed a rash or skin discoloration that looked like petechiae but wasn't petechiae. And I knew it wasn't petechiae because it blanched when I put pressure on it. In other words, the skin turned white underneath it, the old glass test. But saying that the rash didn't look the same is very odd. Why pick that rash then? Why pick meningococcal septicemia, petechiae, from that disease to compare it to the rash that you've seen when you've just said that it didn't look like it? Why not pick rubella, variola, or any other rash? Why choose a rash that didn't look like the rash you had seen before, didn't fit with the situation, and in fact was completely different than anything we would see in meningococcal septicemia? This is the non-comparative comparator, a technique used all the time in this trial, and which we covered in the episode, I think it was called Apples and Oranges or something. The baby responded remarkably quickly. Therefore, ergo, it could not have been meningococcal septicemia. So why use that description to tell your story? Is it because deep down you thought it was sepsis, which is the most likely conclusion, but you want to lead us away from that way of thinking? Why is your history to the Thirlwell inquiry not a proper medical history? And then the registrar confirms that she had personally raised the issue of an environmental toxin and that Pseudomonas was being considered, but it wasn't considered during the trial. And then, getting back to Sarah Napton's story earlier, this registrar said to the inquiry that by September 2015, 3 months after the death of BBA, staff were starting to think the unthinkable, that someone was deliberately causing harm to the infants. She said she had started to feel nervous. But like Dr. Jerram, she didn't do anything. And I'm sorry, but she has to explain why. Things were so bad, in fact, that she said, I was almost expecting something bad to happen. Close the unit then. Don't just carry on as if nothing's happening. I remember on more than one occasion almost the heart-sink feeling of, oh gosh, what is going to happen today? She's describing babies dying, and she uses a term like heart-sick. I had a heart-sick feeling that babies were going to die, and her only response to that, as a responsible adult, was to feel nervous. In other words, anticipate another death. This is just such utter bullshit. Sorry. And this is also something that you don't deal with on your own, and you don't have to deal with on your own. You go to your legal advisor, you ask them what to do. You go to the Child Death Oversight Panel, you ask them what to do. You can do it by telephone, anonymously. You go to the coroner's office and ask them what to do, anonymously, if you wish. And then in the same article, another registrar gives us a more grounded opinion when he says that when he worked as a paediatric registrar at the Countess of Chester between September 2015 and March 2016, there were more unwell babies in the neonatal unit during his placement compared to when he had previously worked there in 2012 to 2013. Asked about whether he was concerned about the general standard of care at the unit, he said, "There were times when I felt that we were managing babies who were more unwell than I might have expected to, or when we managed babies who had deteriorations, they were not necessarily transferred off the unit the way I might have expected them to be." Why was that not said in court? I don't think, he carries on, that the processes or culture had necessarily changed, but I think there were a greater number of unwell babies during my second placement. And sadly, what that requires in a situation assessment background risk analysis is a change in culture and process, because both of those things are not suited to that new environment. Why was that not discussed at Letby's trial? The doctor told the inquiry that before he joined the Countess of Chester Hospital in September 2015, he had heard that the neonatal team were having a bad time, with deaths and unexpected collapses. Well, they weren't having as bad a time as the babies were. And he carries on that his assumption was that it was bad luck and a bad run. He said, "I had no recollection of the discussion of a cause. So much for thinking the unthinkable." And this doctor says that he was on call for the 2 collapses of baby H, a girl who was born prematurely, again prematurely, at the hospital on September 22nd, and the unexpected collapse of baby I in October 2015. Asked by Claire Brown, KC, the counsel for the inquiry, whether he had concerns that Letby was present during the collapses, the doctor said no. Why wasn't this presented at the trial? Following the death of baby P, a triplet boy, in June 2016, a trainee doctor at the time told the nurse, "Nurse death is on again." Nurse death being Lucy Letby. And the doctor who said that carries on, "I did say that at the time I didn't have any awareness of the suspicions among the consultant body with regards to Lucy Letby actively causing harm. Did she have any suspicion that they were overpressurizing baby's lungs? Because as a trainee, that's what you're supposed to be learning." And then more storytelling. "Never did I think the unthinkable. Nurse death is on again, but never did I think the unthinkable. That somebody would be going to work to actively harm babies. So it's okay if they go to work to inactively harm babies by overpressurizing their lungs, for example." Precisely the kind of thing that a training doctor should be focusing on, as I've said. And Miss Langsdale, for the inquiry, she asks this doctor, what association had you made about her, though, to say, "Nurse death's on again"? And then amazingly, this doctor said to the counsel, "I had noticed that she was there at a couple of the unexplained child collapses and deaths, but I thought that was more about bad luck rather than her being the causative agent." And that means that this doctor was there too, in a moment of self-reflection. Did it ever occur to her that she might be the problem? Evidently not. And then again, bizarrely, another registrar who worked alongside Letby in 2016 told the inquiry that he did not believe CCTV would have stopped Letby harming infants. He said, "I'm not sure it would have dealt with a lot of the ways in which she killed, and it may have given false reassurance that things were all right. It would be hard to tell from CCTV that someone was injecting her into the baby's bloodstreams," he said. But ironically, and again, there is no God like irony, it is relatively easy to say when you don't have CCTV. And he goes on to say that one of the common syringes used to give children's medications is a 1 ml syringe, which is soft and made out of glass. Soft glass. At the point where that is filled with fluids, it can sometimes be really hard to tell, looking directly at it, to see if there is fluid in it or it's filled with air. I'm not sure you would be able to tell from a digital image further away. Oh dear. No mention of pumping her into a nasogastric tube. No mention of kicking the baby in the side. No mention of stabbing the baby in the throat. No, we'll fall back on the older embolism trick. Here's an application number for a patent for a device in Australia. The application number is 2021-225235, and it's an application on behalf of Bayer Healthcare. And the title of the patent application is System and Method for Syringe Fluid Fill Verification and Image Recognition of Power Injector System Features. And the abstract of the patent application: a fluid injection system and a fluid verification system for confirming that a syringe containing a fluid for injection is fully fitted with fluid and neither has free space, i.e. air, near the distal end thereof when the syringe is provided in an upright position, nor contains air bubbles. Imaging processing techniques and systems are also provided to determine various injection parameters to verify the type and certain properties of fluid that is present within a syringe. There you go. And the capabilities of motherboards, lenses, and image enhancement isn't much different, if at all, from that which was available in 2015 and 2016. And remember, BBI was a preterm baby put on a ventilator without paralysis or surfactant, and the pressure likely too high, which blew the lungs apart, causing a pneumothorax. And when they treated the pneumothorax suboptimally, as they say, they left a butterfly needle sticking out the back of it. But they didn't stop to think, or this doctor didn't stop to think, that perhaps this was the reason babies were dying. And for who the expert Dowie Evans said there was no reason why it would have a collapse and desaturation. Whereas the truth is, if you treat a premature baby like that, it's absolutely going to have desaturations. And you might even kill the baby. And BBI, of course, did very well when the baby was in Liverpool Women's Hospital and collapsed almost immediately when it returned to the Countess of Chester Hospital. When the endotracheal tube came out and the nasogastric tube was curled up in the esophagus and couldn't drain the excess air in the stomach, put there again likely because of overventilation, but said to be put there by Lucy Letby, injecting her into the nasogastric tube, which this doctor wants us to believe a CCTV wouldn't have captured. It's all just hogwash from start to finish. I'll leave you a link to all of these articles, but they really are pathetic from a medical content point of view. But we have to remember that these junior doctors were very junior at the time, and it would be really unfair to find them guilty of anything because they weren't supervised. And then we have another brick in the wall falling out with a lovely article from David Rose from Unheard, UNHERD, a highly recommended news source who did very well during the COVID crisis. And this article, again from February the 1st, Dowie Evans isn't shy about his role in the conviction of Lucy Letby. After offering his service to the police in May of 2017, the retired paediatrician claims it took him 10 minutes to work out that murder had taken place at the Countess of Chester Hospital. The rest, as they say, is history. It was Evans' analysis that led to a damning chart being shown at Letby's 10-month trial 3 years ago, supposedly demonstrating that she had been present whenever a baby died or collapsed in suspicious circumstances at the hospital's neonatal unit between June 2015 and 2016. But did the chart tell the whole story? Today, I can reveal evidence that casts fresh doubt, derived from unpublished notes taken by a police officer at the time. It shows that when Evans first detailed his findings to senior detectives from Cheshire Police and National Crime Agency experts over 2 days in October 2017, a number of his conclusions were strikingly different from those presented in court, and yet the jury was never told about them. Some of the discrepancies were relatively minor. For example, during Letby's trial, the court was told by one of her colleagues that the health of victim known as Baby K began to deteriorate after Letby deliberately dislodged her breathing tube. Reviewing the evidence in 2017, however, Evans originally told the police he believed Baby K died from natural causes and had no suspicions about the case. She had been born prematurely and simply deteriorated. In an earlier email to police, he pointed out that the health of such babies was often unstable. Letby was convicted of attempting to murder Baby K after a retrial last year, when the first jury could not reach a verdict on her case. Other discrepancies contained within the official notes written by Detective Sergeant Janet Moore are more serious. In fact, according to Evans' initial analysis, and as the chart below illustrates, Letby was not in the hospital when 10 of the 28 incidents he described as suspicious took place, more than a third of them. In other words, if Evans' initial analysis suggested there had been multiple murders, Letby could not have committed all of them. The inconsistencies began with the very first case, that of Baby A, who died on the 8th of June 2015, supposedly after having air injected into his stomach. The jury convicted Letby of murdering him after hearing that, after being born 9 weeks premature, his condition deteriorated after Letby came on shift at 7:30 p.m. According to Moore's meeting notes, however, Evans regarded the entire period after 5 p.m. as relevant. That is, the baby could have started to deteriorate before Letby arrived, which is absolutely true. And in one of my earlier podcasts about Baby A, I say in the podcast that the tipping point for me in that case was the fact the registrar walked past the baby at 5 o'clock, knowing that it had no venous access and had been without fluids and glucose for hours, and it would be another 3 hours before the baby got any fluids or glucose. Another case Evans thought suspicious was of Baby A's twin, Baby B. The trial was told she collapsed and almost died at about 12:30 a.m. on June the 10th, when Letby was on duty, and the nurse was later convicted of attempted murder. But when Evans met the police in 2017, he suggested the child had been subject to a further attack on June the 19th, when at 10:50 p.m. she was either injected with intravenous air or smothered by a hand over her face. Evans said the police should focus their inquiries on the period that started at 9:30 p.m. However, nothing was said about the second incident at Letby's trial, probably because she clocked off that day at 8 p.m. And these were all the Dowie Evans sloppy sifting reports, where he clearly hadn't honed in on Letby at this point, and claims he never did. But the point of this notebook from Sergeant Moore is that Dowie's tale of not honing in on Lucy Letby is beginning to look as tattered as the arse of his trousers. The article goes on, the next child Letby was convicted of murdering was Baby C. It is already known that Evans altered his account of his death at the trial. He had claimed in a report written a few weeks before the trial started that X-ray evidence demonstrated that Baby C had been fatally injured on June the 12th, 2015, when air was injected into his stomach via a nasogastric tube. There's no coming back from that statement, is there? Fatally injured. However, the article continues, By the time Evans gave evidence, it had emerged that Lucy Letby had not been at work on the 12th of June, prompting him to change his story and claim she must have administered the fatal injection the following day. Cross-examining Evans, Letby's barrister Ben Myers-Casey accused him of massaging his evidence to avoid inconvenient truths. Evans said he disagreed, and it seemed the jury believed him. Yet, concealed altogether from the trial was Evans' account to police in October 2017. Then, Moore's notes say he thought the critical event was the discovery at 7 a.m. on June the 12th that BBC's UV line, an umbilical catheter used to administer fluids and medicine to sick newborn babies, had come out. As we say on this podcast, one of the house specialties of the Countess of Chester Hospital. Can this be explained? Evans asked. If the UV line being out is suspicious, then death is suspicious. Again, there was no mention of the fact that Letby was not on duty on the 12th of June. In fact, she had not been at work at all since BBC's birth on the 10th of June. In a similar story, with the case of baby I, who, according to Evans, at the trial, Letby murdered by injecting air into her bloodstream on the 22nd of October 2015. But in 2017, he told the police about an earlier suspicious incident when baby I went into respiratory arrest at 10 p.m. on the 30th of June and began to struggle to breathe. Her abdomen was distended, Evans said in his initial report to police, suggesting that she had been attacked with air into the stomach, which might have been injected through her milk line. That's nasogastric tube to you and me. The jury did hear that her condition worsened that night, but no evidence that this was Lucy Letby's fault. After all, her roster record makes clear she was not at work that night. And then there's the death of baby O. The case that persuaded Evans that there was a murder at the Countess of Chester Hospital within 10 minutes of starting to review the hospital medical records he was shown by police. At the trial, the jury was told baby O had been stable until the afternoon of the 23rd of June 2016, when he suffered a remarkable deterioration, inverted commas. But when Evans met with the police in 2017, he said there was already problems before the collapse and that by 5 a.m. his heart rate was climbing, a sure sign he was not in good health. This was, he concluded, suspicious, and what had happened overnight on the 22nd and 23rd of June was relevant. He may well have been correct, the article goes on, but on the night in question, Letby was not at work. Indeed, last month, MP David Davies revealed in Parliament that an assessment of baby O's medical condition by two neonatal consultants had found that the impact injury, inverted commas, to her liver that triggered severe internal bleeding was inflicted not by Letby, but by a consultant paediatrician, who inadvertently stabbed the organ with a needle. The same doctor, Davis said, went on to become one of Letby's principal accusers and gave evidence at her trial. Suffice it to say that none of this featured during Letby's trial, though other doubts about Evans did surface. It emerged, for instance, that the Court of Appeal Lord Justice Jackson had taken the extraordinary step of writing to the trial judge, Mr. Justice Goss, detailing how a report drawn up by Evans in an unrelated family case had been dismissed as worthless. Evans, he claimed, had breached his duty as an expert by deciding on the outcome he wanted, then working out an explanation to achieve it. Of greatest concern, Jackson wrote, Dr. Evans makes no effort to provide a balanced opinion. He suggested this might amount to a breach of proper professional conduct. This warning was not taken lightly. I have seen a further unpublished document that suggests that Jackson's email to the judge produced alarm in the prosecution camp. It shows that on January the 9th, 2023, Crown Prosecution Service lawyers held a meeting with Evans in which they posed scripted questions about Jackson's criticism. This is extraordinary stuff, great journalism. Evans appeared untroubled, saying, I stand by my report, which he also said in the court. And the article continues that the Court of Appeal has refused her permission to appeal and found that there could have been no arguable basis for excluding the evidence given by Evans at the trial. And I argued on this podcast that the appeal court judges had completely misunderstood the content and intention of Justice Jackson's letter to them. They chose to narrowly interpret the letter as relating only to this report, when clearly to anyone who reads the letter, it was a criticism of Evans himself, not just this report that he wrote, and we covered that in one of the podcasts recently. As for Evans, the article says in October last year, he submitted yet another report on the baby's death to Cheshire Police, which has thus far refused to disclose it to Letby's new lawyer, Mark MacDonald, who is fighting to get the case reopened. Beyond this, Evans is reluctant to be drawn on his initial report. When I put detailed written questions about the issues raised in this article to Evans, he declined to respond, saying, "I decided as of mid-December last year to make no comment pending the completion of Lady Thirlwell's public inquiry," summing up in March, I understand, "and Cheshire Police completing their investigation." But of course we know that Cheshire Police's investigation is never going to stop, and we also know that Darry Evans doesn't tell the truth all the time, and so he will make comment. This investigation is completed because he can't help himself. So more damning evidence against Operation Hummingbird, but we now get to the last article, the return of Hugh Lee. We remember Professor Hugh Lee, along with Tanswell, his colleague, wrote the infamous Lee and Tanswell paper from 1989 that was used as the basis for deciding that Lucy Letby injected babies with air. Despite what the Court of Appeal says, every single person that I've spoken to believes that to be the case, because we can all read English. And this article is entitled "My Research Was Misused to Convict Lucy Letby, So I Did My Own Inquiry." Dr. Hugh Lee, a neonatologist whose 30-year-old paper was a pivotal part of the Lucy Letby trial, and an expert panel have re-examined the case and reached explosive conclusions. Now, this should be a nail in the coffin of Operation Hummingbird and the beginning of the end for these poor parents and for Lucy Letby. But it won't be. We have gone through the Court of Appeal judgment, and we know that when you multiply nonsense with nonsense, you get even worse nonsense. And worse nonsense is always harder to get out of than the original nonsense. The Court of Appeal judges had the opportunity to order a retrial, and they refused to do so, and now their names are going to go down in history as well. The article in the Times from February the 1st, 2024 reads, "Dr. Hugh Lee, a retired neonatologist, was in the middle of harvest season on his farm in Alberta, Canada, when he received a letter which would draw him into the case of UK's most prolific serial killer, Lucy Letby. It was autumn 2023, and Lee knew virtually nothing about the nurse who several months earlier had been found guilty of murdering 7 babies and trying to kill 6 others. It was a UK story," he said. "We didn't hear much about it in Canada, and I think all I had seen was a very little story, no more than a few column inches in the paper, saying that a nurse in the UK had been convicted of murdering multiple babies. It was something I read in passing and thought, oh, what a terrible thing, before going on to read the rest of the news." Unbeknown to Lee, an academic paper he had co-authored more than 30 years earlier had been used to help convict Letby. Now, 18 months after the neonatal nurse was given a whole life sentence, Lee is preparing to make a significant intervention in her case and has flown more than 4,000 miles to London to lead a press conference on behalf of Letby's legal team. Truly, truly stunning, historical and unprecedented. On Tuesday, that's the 4th of February 2025, he will unveil details of an independent review by a blue ribbon committee of 14 international medical experts into the causes of death of the 17 babies Letby was accused of harming. So the parents are now going to hear on the 4th what actually happened to their babies and to them. And try as they might, the British judicial system has nowhere to hide. The Times continues, it is understood that in a large number of cases, if not all, the experts have recorded a different cause of death from the one used in Lucy Letby's prosecution. It comes just weeks after Letby's legal team said they would attempt a fresh challenge over her conviction on the grounds that the lead prosecution medical expert at her trial was not reliable. Oh, he was reliable, all right, but not, I suspect, in the way that Mark MacDonald means. Mark MacDonald, Letby's barrister, said he would seek permission from the Court of Appeal to take the exceptional but necessary decision to apply to reopen her case. During Letby's trial at Manchester Crown Court, the retired consultant paediatrician, Dr. Dowie Evans, gave evidence about Letby targeting a number of infants at the Countess of Chester Hospital neonatal unit by injecting air into their bloodstreams. The prosecution said this caused an air embolism that blocked their blood supply and led to sudden and unexpected collapse, in some cases fatal. Supporting this theory, Evans referenced a 1989 academic paper by Lee, which looked at air embolism in the bloodstream in babies and said skin discoloration pointed to air embolism as a result of high-pressure ventilation. Evans' evidence is understood to have been vital to Letby's conviction. Unbelievably not, according to the Court of Appeal ruling. He has since said concerns regarding his evidence were unsubstantiated, unfounded and inaccurate. Questions about it started to emerge within weeks of the verdict when Letby's legal team wrote to Lee to ask for help. This weekend, Lee, 67, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto, an honorary physician at the city's Mount Sinai Hospital, and President of the Canadian Neonatal Foundation, has spoken for the first time about how he became involved. They first contacted me around October 2023, he said. I was so busy with the harvest that I didn't pay any attention to it. And then later on I was checking my mail and there it was again. I don't usually do medical legal cases. I don't enjoy them, so I don't do them. But this one got me interested because they had used my paper. They asked me whether I would look at the evidence for them and wanted to know if the paper, was correctly interpreted. He agreed. I was asked to review the court transcripts which related to the evidence given about the paper he wrote entitled Pulmonary Vascular Air Embolism in the Newborn, published in the Archives of Disease in Childhood in 1989. The paper described a distinctive rash of bright pink blood vessels against blue skin as an indicator of air embolism. Speaking at the business lounge of a central London hotel on Thursday, Lee said, I looked at the court transcripts and I wasn't very happy because what they were interpreting wasn't exactly what I said. And we know it wasn't even close to what he said. He later agreed to give evidence in Letby's appeal and said that none of the descriptions of the skin discoloration in the nurse's case matched those characteristic of air embolism. According to Lee, there are two specific signs of air embolism. The Lee sign, a specific skin discoloration characterized by pink, red blood vessels visible against a bluish-blue background named after Professor Lee himself. And the Liebermeister sign, when the pale areas are seen on the tongue, both were absent. And that means in the Letby cases, both were absent. He added that infants in the trial should never have been diagnosed with air embolism, as it was a very rare and specific condition and should not be diagnosed by excluding other causes of death or collapse, and concluding that it must be a case of air embolism because nothing else could be found. However, the appeal court judges said his evidence, that's Lee's evidence, was inadmissible because he was not called to the trial by Letby's defence. They said no good reason has been shown why the applicant should now be allowed to adduce evidence which could have been obtained and adduced at the appropriate time. But sadly, the Court of Appeal judges said a lot more than that. The article continues, Lee said last week, so what they were saying during the trial was that the baby and he had this skin discoloration which equals our embolism. And what I said during the appeal was, no, it doesn't. Although he said that in cases of our embolism, there are instances of skin discoloration, this can also be caused by hypoxia when the body or region of the body is deprived of adequate oxygen at tissue level. Hypoxia can be caused by a number of factors, including heart and respiratory problems and infections. Any kind of hypoxia, Dr. Lee says, can cause these discolorations, and the reason is that when you are hypoxic, the blood vessels in the body try to protect your organs, so it shunts all the blood to your brain, to the heart, and so reduces the blood supply going to the skin because the skin is less important. As listeners to this podcast know, that is what we call the shock response. As a result, Dr. Lee goes on, the local blood vessels in the skin try to react by redistributing the blood in the skin. Lee also said that the skin discoloration was only a factor in around 10% of our embolism cases, whereas in the cases of the Letby victims, it was present in 9 of the 17 babies. And he said, if 10% of our embolism show skin discoloration, then if there are 9 cases with skin discoloration, then there must be 81 other cases of our embolism deaths with no skin discoloration. Well, that's not actually mathematically true, because each event is not related to the other. That's the old coin toss. 50-50. Just because you've tossed 5 heads in a row doesn't mean that the next toss of the coin is more likely to be a tail. Each toss of the coin will be 50-50. So, according to Dr. Lee, there should be a total of 90 deaths in this hospital from our embolism, 9 with skin discoloration and 81 without, to prove this theory. God, why is it that doctors are so bad at mathematics? But he carries on. So unless you can tell me there were 90 babies in the hospital that died from our embolism, of which 9 showed this, that doesn't make any sense. Lee also said that instances of our embolism were very rare, which again has no impact on the 50-50 argument that he's making. When he wrote the paper in 1989, there had only been 57 cases. Even now, there have been only 117 cases in babies anywhere in the world. And that's very interesting, isn't it? Because Dr. Lee is referring to reported cases. And as we all know, the Letby babies were unreported cases because the consultants didn't write down the discoloration at the time. They wouldn't fit into any case series study anywhere in the world at any time in history. Because, as far as the authors of any such paper would say, that's no use to me. You could just as easily have made that up. Lee has recently updated his original academic paper, which did not distinguish between arterial, blood vessels that bring oxygen-rich blood from your heart to all of your body cells, and venous, a network of veins that carries deoxygenated blood from the body's tissues and organs back to the heart, or embolism. The point that we have been making all along, that there are distinct classifications of this disorder. The latest version, published in the American Journal of Perinatology before Christmas, found no cases of skin discoloration linked to our embolism by the venous system. Zilch, nada, none. The route by which R was said to have been injected into Letby's victims. After Letby's appeal was rejected, Lee spoke to her legal team and asked what happens now. He was told that the case had run out of road, and the only option was to apply to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which investigates potential miscarriages of justice. Well, they're supposed to investigate potential miscarriages of justice. bar would be very high, the lawyers said. What they said to me was that you have literally got to find a different person or thing that caused the death, said Lee. And I asked, so what's the chances? They said none, because it's going to be very hard to prove anything now. We've had our chance, and unless you come up with something that is totally different, she'll be in jail for the rest of her life. And I said, well, this is not fair, because the evidence that was used to convict her, in my opinion, wasn't quite right. You don't say. Lee said that if, by some mistake, she had been sent to prison wrongly, he felt that he had to help put it right. He asked if he could examine the 35,000 pages of medical evidence to assess whether it was faulty or good. He suggested that if he found further problems with the evidence, he would convene a panel of the best experts in the world to look at the case. He offered to work pro bono and said the only condition was that his findings would be published, irrespective of whether they were favourable to Letby. After conferring with Letby, her legal team agreed. Lee brought together 14 experts from 6 countries, including the United States, Canada, Japan, Sweden, Germany, and the UK. I wanted to have a panel that was highly distinguished, highly experienced, whose reputations and credibility were beyond reproach, so that they could say authoritatively what they thought was going on. So I contacted them and they said yes. Isn't that truly amazing? Each baby was randomly assigned to 2 experts to independently review the case. The instructions have been very simple, he said. First, look at the medical records and decide what you feel is the cause of death or injury and what is the evidence for it. Second, look at the medical expert's statement, see whether they are consistent with what you have said and whether you would change your opinion based on what they had said. That's Bowen and Evans and all the other lightweight experts. And then third, issue an independent report based on what you have seen. If their opinions differed, then a third expert was assigned to review the baby and consensus was then reached, but this has only happened in 2 of the 17 babies. And that is a remarkably small number, 11%. And I'm going to guess beforehand that the 2 babies that they couldn't reach this agreement upon straight away were baby A and baby E, and that's because baby E didn't have a post-mortem, and therefore there could only be a consensus on what caused the death of baby E, but we can't really know, and baby A's post-mortem was inconclusive. But this is purely a guess on my part, and we'll have to wait till tomorrow till we find out. Alongside Letby's legal team and the Conservative MP David Davies, who had previously called for a retrial, Lee will present the findings of the panel on Tuesday. Remaining tight-lipped about what are understood to be explosive conclusions, he said, "What I can say is that we looked at the cases in great detail and we came to a very definite conclusion about what happened in every case. I think they will be of interest because there's been a lot of press about this and many different opinions. What we have done is to remove all the emotion and conjecture to basically just look at the evidence." And so, like you, I am really looking forward to tomorrow. I try not to wish my life away, but this is an extraordinary event even in medicine, which in my opinion helps to put the profession back onto a good solid footing. So we'll see what happens tomorrow, and I'm going to try and do a podcast tomorrow on the findings of Lee and his blue ribbon expert panel so that I can explain their conclusions to you. And I look forward immensely as well to reading the published article, which I've no doubt will be a tour de force, and it'll be worth more than 20 Thirlwell inquiries. The British people and the NHS are about to get a master class in methodology, and it's not before time. So we'll leave it there, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.